Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time and temperature. Tonight we step away from the hum of modern cooling, the click of thermostats, the chill of processed air, and we drift backward to a sun-scorched plateau where summers burned without mercy and winters bit deep into bone. Imagine yourself in ancient Persia on the Iranian plateau where the sun climbs each morning with relentless determination. The air shimmers, the dust settles on your skin, and the rhythm of life moves according to heat and shadow. Here, ordinary people endured, adapted, and invented ways to survive the blazing months without a single mechanical comfort. Before we settle into this quiet passage through Persia's unforgiving summers, I'd like to ask a small favor. Tap the like button, if you will, and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these late-night journeys into forgotten corners of the past can continue to find you. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from, what hour of day or night finds you here. Some of you may be wrapped in darkness, others greeting morning light, still others suspended in that strange in-between. Now let the lights fade. Perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that soothing background wash of sound. Let your thoughts slow, your breathing deepen, and allow yourself to drift with me into the story of how people lived before air conditioning. You are a young craftsman in a modest adobe house on the Iranian plateau, summer of the 10th century. The year matters less than the season, and the season presses down on everything with the weight of heated stone. Your dwelling sits among others like it, packed earth walls rising from dust, a flat roof patched with clay tiles and straw. The walls are thick, mud brick layered and plastered, designed to hold back the sun's assault, but they succeed only partially. Each morning you wake before dawn because the heat arrives early, creeping through the shutters, rising from the ground itself. You step outside into air already warming, dust suspended in the light. The sky stretches pale and enormous, cloudless, indifferent. Your first task is water, always water. You walk to the Qanat, that underground channel dug generations ago to carry snowmelt from distant mountains. The entrance is a dark mouth in the earth, cool air exhaling from its depths. You descend carefully, feeling the temperature drop, your skin prickling with relief. Down here the air is different. Damp, mineral, almost sweet. You fill your clay vessels, pausing to let the coolness settle into your bones, knowing it will evaporate the moment you emerge. This brief respite is one of the small mercies of your day. Back at the surface, the sun strikes you like a physical blow. You carry the heavy vessels carefully, water sloshing, your tunic already beginning to stick to your shoulders. The journey home feels longer than it is. Inside your house, you set the water in the coolest corner, covering the vessels with damp cloth. The thick walls do provide some protection. The interior remains dimmer, a few degrees less punishing than outside. But only a few degrees, and as the day progresses, even this margin shrinks. Your dwelling has small windows set high, designed to let light in while keeping direct sun out. In late afternoon, you will open the wooden shutters to capture any breeze, hoping the wind tower on your neighbor's roof might share its blessing. For now, you keep them closed against the climbing heat. The wind tower, the Badger, rises from the more prosperous houses in town. Yours lacks one, though you have studied their construction, admired their geometry. They catch the slightest breeze and funnel it downward through vertical shafts, drawing warm air up and out while pulling cooler air from underground channels. You cannot afford such refinement. Your cooling strategy is simpler. Thick walls, strategic ventilation, sleeping on the roof when nights permit. And endurance, always endurance. Your work today involves repairing the plaster on your courtyard wall, where last month's heat caused expansion and cracking. The sun has baked the mud brick beneath until small fissures opened like dried riverbed. You mix fresh plaster, clay, and straw, and water, working quickly before it dries in your hands. The courtyard is exposed, shadowless at midday. You wait until late morning to begin, hoping to finish before the worst heat arrives. Your fingers work the plaster into the cracks, smoothing it, pressing it firm. Sweat runs down your temples, stings your eyes. Your breathing grows heavier not from exertion but from the thickness of the air itself. The dust you raised mixing the plaster coats your throat. By midday, you must stop. The sun overhead is a hammer, the courtyard floor radiates heat, and your body begins to slow with that dangerous heaviness that precedes collapse. You retreat inside, splash water on your face and arms, lie on the coolest patch of floor. This is the rhythm of summer days. Work in early morning, rest during peak heat, resume in late afternoon. Productivity drops, time stretches, the weeks blur into a shimmering sameness. You watch the elite pass sometimes, carried in covered litters or walking through shaded arcades, and you feel the distance between their experience and yours. Your wife tends the hearth, despite the heat, because the family must eat. She bakes flatbread on heated stones, the fire adding its own punishment to the already stifling room. The bread must be made, the lentils must be cooked, and so she works with her headscarf dampened, pausing frequently to wipe her face. The children retreat to the shadiest corner, listless, their usual energy drained away. They drink often from the clay vessels, and you watch the water level drop, calculating how soon you must return to the qanat. Water is currency in summer, more precious than silver. As afternoon wanes, you return to your plastering work. The angle of the sun has shifted now, throwing a narrow band of shadow along the courtyard wall. You work within this shadow, chasing it as it moves, knowing you have perhaps 2 hours before darkness. Your hands are raw from the alkaline plaster, your back aches from stooping, but the work must be finished before the next dust storm arrives, before the next cycle of heat expansion cracks the wall again. This is maintenance, endless and necessary. Evening brings its own rituals. You carry a coarse mat to the roof, spreading it on the clay tiles, still warm from the day's absorption. Your wife follows with thin blankets, the children trailing behind. The family will sleep here tonight as you do most summer nights. Below, inside the house, the walls hold heat like a bread oven. The air is motionless, stale, unbearable. But up here, as darkness deepens, there is the possibility of breeze. The stars emerge brilliant and uncountable. You lie on your mat and feel the tiles slowly cooling beneath you. The warmth seeps upward through the fabric, through your tunic, into your skin. It will be hours before they release their stored heat, hours before the air temperature drops enough to matter. The sounds of evening settle around you, the distant bleat of goats penned for the night, the murmur of other families on other roofs, the creak of wind tower vanes rotating in a breath of moving air. Someone coughs. A baby cries briefly and is soothed. You watch the darkness between stars and think about water, always water. The qanat must be kept clear of silt, its channels maintained, its access points guarded. Without it, the town would empty, would return to dust. The underground streams are your lifeline, and in summer that lifeline feels perilously thin. Sleep comes eventually, fitful and shallow. You wake several times in the night to shift position, to check the children, to gauge the temperature. Once you wake to find the air moving slightly, a genuine breeze sliding across the rooftop, and you lie very still, savoring it before drifting back to sleep. Dawn arrives too soon. The sky lightens from black to deep blue to pale rose, and already you feel the heat beginning its daily climb. You rise stiff from the hard surface, roll the mats, herd the children down the exterior stairs. Another day begins. The morning routine repeats: the walk to the qanat, the descent into coolness, the filling of vessels, the return journey with water heavy and sloshing. Your body knows this pattern, performs it with minimal thought. This is summer, this is life, this is the bargain you make with the plateau's climate. The marketplace suffers in deep summer. Fewer people venture out during peak heat, business clusters in early morning and late evening. The merchants hang damp fabric over their stalls, sit in whatever shade they can create, fan themselves with palm fronds. Transactions slow, voices grow quiet, the usual bustle mutes to a languid patience. You bring your repair work to the market sometimes, small clay vessels mended, tools sharpened, simple carpentry. The income is modest but necessary. You sit in your spot, a tattered awning providing minimal shade, and wait for customers who arrive sporadically. The heat makes people irritable but also passive. Arguments flare briefly and subside. Everyone understands that energy must be conserved, that anger burns calories the body cannot spare. You see this restraint in faces, in the slow, deliberate movements, in the way conversations trail off into silence. Water sellers move through the marketplace with their goatskin bags, calling their presence. People pay for a cup, drink it standing, return the cup. The water is warm but wet, and that is sufficient. You buy a cup yourself, rationing your coins, feeling the liquid trace a path down your throat into your parched core. Dust storms arrive without much warning in summer. The wind rises suddenly, hot and fierce, carrying particles of the plateau's surface. You see the brown wall approaching, have just enough time to shutter the windows, cover the water vessels, bring the children inside. Then the world disappears into brown haze. Inside you sit with damp cloths over nose and mouth, waiting. The dust infiltrates everything despite your precautions, settles on the floor, coats the water surfaces, grits between your teeth. The storm may last an hour or a day, there is no predicting. Afterward comes the sweeping, the shaking of fabrics, the replastering of walls where wind-driven sand has scoured away the surface. Your wife sweeps the courtyard 3 times, but still the dust lingers. You taste it for days. The local hammam, the public bath, offers another small mercy. Once a week, if you can afford it, you visit in early evening when the heat of the day has peaked and broken. The bath building is thick-walled, dim, its chambers arranged to manage steam and temperature. You pay your coins, pass through the entrance chamber into the warm room. The air is humid, a different kind of heat, gentler somehow. Other men sit on the marble benches, skin gleaming, speaking in low voices. You settle onto the stone, feeling its coolness through its wetness. In the hot room, the steam rises from heated floors enveloping you. For a few minutes, the outside world, the dust, the sun, the endless thirst, fades away. Your muscles unknot, your breathing deepens. An attendant brings a bucket of tepid water, pours it over your head, and you feel momentarily reborn. But the relief is temporary. When you emerge into evening air, the heat rushes back, your skin dries within minutes, and by the time you reach home, you are sweating again. Still, the memory of coolness sustains you, gives you something to anticipate next week. Mosquitoes breed in standing water, so you must balance the need for water storage against the danger of breeding pests. You cover the cistern carefully, check it daily, skim off any larvae you find. At night, the whine of mosquitoes near your ear is another trial, another small torture added to the others. The children suffer insect bites, scratch until they bleed, develop small infections that must be tended with poultices. Your wife boils herbs in precious water, makes pastes, applies them patiently. Everything requires water, and the summer supply feels always on the edge of insufficiency. You watch the wealthy in their compounds, through gaps in walls, through open gates as you pass. Their courtyards contain fountains, actual fountains, with water flowing continuously, a waste so extravagant it staggers you. The sound alone must provide comfort, the visual shimmer, the evaporative cooling. Their houses rise 2 stories with deep loggias facing north, catching morning light but avoiding afternoon sun. Their roofs have proper wind towers with directional vanes that rotate to capture breeze from any quarter. Their clothes are finer linen, dyed in light colors that reflect heat rather than absorb it. You do not begrudge them exactly, envy requires energy, you cannot spare, but you note the difference. They shape their environment through architecture and wealth. You adapt your body and schedule. Both strategies address the same sun, but the experience of summer differs vastly. Some nights you sleep so fitfully that dawn finds you already exhausted. Your wife wakes with a headache from dehydration, drinks half a vessel of water before she can face the day. The children move slowly, their young faces serious, aged beyond their years by the relentless season. You calculate constantly. How many more weeks until autumn, until the first cool night, until morning air carries a different quality? The plateau's summer is long, stretching from late spring through early autumn. You are only halfway through, only your clothing is minimal, a loose tunic, light trousers, sandals. Your wife's garments are similarly practical, though modesty requires more coverage than comfort would prefer. The fabric clings to sweat, chafes, must be washed frequently. In water you can barely afford to spare. Everything is compromise. The town's water supply from the Qanat diminishes slightly as summer progresses. The snowmelt from mountains is finite, and as the snowpack depletes, so does the flow. You notice the water level in the Qanat channels dropping, the wait at the entrance growing longer as more people queue for their turn. Rumors circulate about wells running dry in other towns, about migrations to higher elevations where springs still flow. You try not to dwell on worst possibilities, but at night, lying on the roof, you run through contingencies. Where would you go if the Qanat failed? How would you move your family? What would you abandon? The mosque offers its own kind of refuge. Its thick walls, its high ceilings, its open courtyard with a central pool, all designed for this climate. You attend prayers more frequently in summer, not from increased devotion, but from the simple comfort of its architecture. Inside the prayer hall, the air is cooler by several degrees. The stone floor draws heat from your feet. The ablution fountain provides an excuse to splash water on face and arms. You pray with others, the ritual offering structure to formless days, and afterward you linger in the shaded arcade. The imams speak sometimes about patience, about endurance, about the paradise that awaits the faithful, where rivers flow with water, milk, and honey. His words paint images of coolness, of ease, and you let yourself imagine such a place. It is a form of respite, this imagining. But then you step back into the sun-hammered world and the imagining dissolves. The reality is stone and dust, heat and thirst, the ache in your back and the rawness of your hands. Paradise may wait beyond life, but this moment demands your full attention. Your evening meal is simple: flatbread, lentils, a little dried fruit. The food is too heavy for the heat, sits in your stomach like a stone, but you need the sustenance. You eat slowly, without appetite, because the body requires fuel, even when the mind rebels against eating. After dinner, you sit in the courtyard as darkness deepens. A neighbor joins you, a man who works in leather, and together you speak little. Words require effort, and the silence is companionable enough. You both understand the shape of this season, its demands and deprivations. He mentions that his wind tower is damaged, one of the vanes cracked in the last dust storm. The repair will cost more than he can easily afford. You offer to help, your carpentry skills might suffice. and he accepts gratefully. In this, you find small purpose. The work on his wind tower takes 2 evenings. You climb to his roof with tools and wood, assess the damage, make the repairs. The mechanism is elegant in its simplicity, vanes that catch wind and direct it down a shaft, the rising heat creating circulation, the whole system requiring no power but the natural movement of air. Standing at the top of the wind tower, you can see across the town, a low sprawl of mud brick buildings, flat roofs, narrow streets. Here and there a minaret rises, a date palm sways. Beyond the town, the plateau stretches to distant mountains, barren and beautiful, and merciless. For a moment up here, the breeze is stronger, fresher. You pause in your work and simply feel it against your face. This is what the wealthy buy with their architecture. This moment, extended and repeated. You understand the desire absolutely. When you finish the repair, your neighbor pays you in dried apricots and a small clay lamp. The payment is fair, the apricots especially welcome. You carry them home feeling something close to satisfaction, a rare emotion, these summer days. The children devour the apricots with delight, their faces brightening. Your wife saves 2 for herself, eating them slowly, savoring each bite. These small pleasures matter more than grand ones, you have learned. A piece of fruit, a breath of breeze, a moment of shade. The moon waxes and wanes, and you measure time by its phases. New moon passes, first quarter, full moon bright enough to cast shadows on the roof where you sleep. The lunar light is gentle, carries no heat, and you lie watching it, silver the edges of sleeping forms around you. You think about your grandfather who lived in this same house, endured these same summers. He died before you knew him well, but stories remain. Stories of his patience, his skill, his resignation to climate. You feel connected to him through this shared ordeal, generation after generation, adapting to the plateau's demands. Someday your children will lie on this roof and remember you, remember these nights. They will tell their children about summers without mechanical relief, about the weight of heat, about resilience, or perhaps they will not. Perhaps they will find ways to escape, to move to cooler regions, to build better solutions. You do not know what the future holds for them. You can only navigate this present, this summer, this day. And so you do with all the patience you can summon. The rhythm of your days acquires a timeless quality. One day resembles the next with only minor variations, the same tasks, the same discomforts, the same small reliefs. You stop counting weeks and simply exist within the heat's embrace. Your body adapts in small ways. You sweat more efficiently, your thirst signals become more precise, your tolerance for discomfort increases marginally. You learn which hours are bearable for work and which demand stillness. You learn to sip water rather than gulp it, to move deliberately rather than quickly. Your wife develops her own adaptations. She works in shorter bursts, rests more frequently, plans meals that require less cooking heat. She sings while she works, old songs from her childhood, and the melody helps mark time's passage. The children invent games that require minimal movement, verbal puzzles, pattern drawing in dust, storytelling. Their laughter still erupts sometimes, bright and sudden, a reminder that life contains more than mere endurance. A traveling merchant passes through town selling blocks of ice wrapped in straw. The ice comes from mountain caves where winter's cold lingers year-round, transported at great expense. Only the wealthy can afford it, but people gather to watch the transaction, to see the miracle of frozen water in midsummer. You stand at the edge of the crowd and watch a block being unwrapped. Even from several paces away, you feel the cold radiating from it, see the water already melting in rivulets. Someone purchases a small chip, holds it to forehead, and sighs. The merchant rewraps the remaining ice, quickly protecting his investment. You turn away before envy can take root. Ice is not for you, not this season, perhaps not ever, but you have seen it, have felt its possibility, and that is something. As weeks accumulate, your plastering work holds. The wall shows no new cracks. You take satisfaction in this small victory over expansion and contraction, over the heat's assault on structure. Your skill matters, your attention to detail matters. The house stands firm. One evening, a genuine coolness enters the air, not merely the relative coolness of night, but an actual temperature drop. People emerge from houses murmuring, checking with neighbors. Is this real? Has something shifted? The coolness lasts only 2 days before the heat returns, but those 2 days feel like reprieve, like a promise. Autumn will come eventually. The plateau's climate follows patterns older than human habitation. You must simply outlast the season. You sleep more deeply those cool nights, wake more refreshed. Your wife's headache disappears. The children race around the courtyard with restored energy. For 2 days you remember what it feels like to inhabit your body without constant awareness of its discomfort. Then the heat returns as if it never left, and the slow endurance resumes. But now you have proof that the season will end, that change remains possible. You hold this knowledge close. The marketplace gossip turns to autumn preparations, when to harvest dates, when to press olives, when to slaughter animals for preserved meat. These future-focused conversations help orient the mind beyond the present heat. Life exists on the far side of summer. You begin planning your own autumn work, repairs that must wait for cooler weather, projects abandoned when the heat grew too severe. Your mental list grows, giving shape to coming months. This is how you survive, by looking forward, by believing in time's progression. Your neighbor with the repaired wind tower reports that it functions better now than before. The directional vanes catch even slight breezes. His family sleeps more comfortably. He offers you more work. Others have heard of your skill, want their own towers adjusted or repaired. You accept gratefully. The work will supplement your primary income, will spread across autumn and winter when you can labor without fighting the sun. You are building something beyond immediate survival, a reputation, a future. On a particularly stifling afternoon, you descend into the qanat for the pure relief of it. You sit on the stone edge of the underground channel, feet dangling in the flowing water, and allow yourself to simply exist in coolness. 10 minutes, 15. No one disturbs you. The water flows past your feet with a gentle sound coming from somewhere distant and dark, traveling toward town and other thirsty people. You are a brief interruption in its journey. You feel your body temperature dropping, your breathing slowing, your thoughts clarifying. These stolen moments of relief make the rest bearable. You climb back to the surface renewed, ready to continue. The heat strikes you, but you are prepared now, fortified by your brief escape. Your final thought before sleep most nights is simple. Tomorrow will be like today, and that is both burden and comfort. The known shape of suffering is easier to bear than the unknown. You have your routines, your strategies, your small mercies. And when autumn finally arrives, when the first genuinely cool morning breaks clear and gentle, you will feel such gratitude for the turning of seasons, such appreciation for the earth's patient rhythms. But that moment lies ahead. For now, you endure. Now we shift our attention from the craftsman's roof to another life unfolding in the same heated world. Let us follow Nasir al-Din al-Tusi through summers that shaped both his scholarship and his survival, through decades where intellectual ambition met the unrelenting reality of the Persian plateau's climate. Born in Tus in the year 1201, Nasir grew into a world of intellectual ferment and physical discomfort, a world where ideas flourished despite conditions that seemed designed to wilt human concentration. His family belonged to the educated class, not wealthy exactly, but comfortable enough to afford books, tutors, leisure for study, the essential luxuries that separated those who might think from those who merely labored. Still, summer pressed on his household as it pressed on all others, making no distinction between the scholar's dwelling and the merchant's shop, between the philosopher's quarters and the craftsman's workshop. His earliest memories included the particular silence of midday heat, that profound hush when even insects ceased their movement and the world seemed to hold its breath against the sun's assault. The household would retreat to interior rooms while the sun hammered the courtyard stones, transforming the open spaces into zones of danger where minutes of exposure could drain a person's strength. His mother dampened cloths and laid them across foreheads, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. His father retreated to a shaded alcove with manuscripts, reading while sweat spotted the pages, leaving translucent marks that would fade but never quite disappear, physical evidence of summer's intrusion into the realm of ideas. Young Nasir showed aptitude for mathematics and astronomy early, displaying not just intelligence but the particular kind of focused curiosity that distinguished true scholars from merely bright students. His tutors recognized his gift, encouraged his questions, set him increasingly complex problems that would have frustrated most children, but that seemed to delight him, to draw him deeper into the elegant structures of mathematical reasoning. But study in summer required discipline of both mind and body. The heat made concentration difficult, made the eyes heavy, made the hand sluggish with the pen, as though the air itself thickened into an invisible barrier between intention and execution. He would sit before his tablet, feeling perspiration gather at his temples, watching it drop onto the surface and blur his careful calculations, each droplet a small defeat in his struggle to maintain precision. He learned to work in the coolest hours, rising before dawn when stars still commanded the sky and the night's relative coolness lingered like a gift soon to be withdrawn. He would carry his tablets and instruments to the roof, calculate positions, plot trajectories, lose himself in the elegant dance of celestial mechanics, while the world below remained wrapped in sleep. Then the sun would rise and he would retreat inside until evening, his productive hours compressed into those margins when the climate briefly permitted sustained thought, when the body did not constantly interrupt the mind with demands for relief. His teenage years coincided with political turbulence, personal coming of age shadowed by the larger unraveling of the world he knew. The Khwarezmian dynasty was crumbling, Mongol pressure building from the east, like a gathering storm whose thunder could already be heard even if the rain had not yet fallen. Scholars like his father spoke nervously about the future, about the safety of libraries, about whether learning could survive conquest, whether knowledge itself might perish in the violence that seemed inevitable. Nasir absorbed these anxieties alongside his studies, learning that intellectual work occurred not in serene isolation, but always against a background of historical forces that could erase in days what had taken generations to build. At 17, he traveled to Nishapur to study under renowned teachers, his departure marked by his mother's tears and his father's grave instructions about which scholars to seek, which theological disputes to avoid. The city impressed him, larger than Tus, more diverse, its libraries more extensive, its intellectual life more vibrant and contentious, full of debates and competing schools of thought. But the heat of Nishapur differed not at all from home, a reminder that geography might change other conditions, but summer remained summer, the sun remained merciless, adaptation remained necessary. The plateau stretched for hundreds of miles in all directions, and nowhere within that expanse could one escape the fundamental challenge of the climate. He lodged in a madrasa, a religious school with thick walls and a shaded courtyard where a fountain splashed day and night, its sound a psychological comfort, even when it did little to actually cool the air. The students slept on the roof in warm months, their mats lined up in rows, bodies arranged like some strange observatory devoted to human endurance rather than celestial observation. At night, they would discuss philosophy, theology, mathematics in low voices while the stars wheeled overhead, their conversations ranging from the nature of divine attributes to the intricacies of geometric proofs. Nasir found community here, found his tribe, discovered that his peculiar passions were not strange but shared, that others too felt called to understand the mathematical structures underlying creation. His teachers emphasized both theoretical and practical knowledge, rejecting the false distinction between pure thought and applied skill. Astronomy was not merely abstract calculation but required careful observation, precise instrumentation, patience to track changes over years and decades, the willingness to subordinate one's immediate interests to a larger project that might outlive any individual contributor. Nasir took to this discipline naturally, his mind suited to both the mathematical rigor and the observational persistence, finding satisfaction in the way theory and practice reinforced each other. How abstract models gained meaning only when tested against the stubborn reality of what actually appeared in the sky. The heat affected his instruments in ways his teachers carefully explained. Metal expanded in the sun, throwing off measurements by margins that seemed small, but that accumulated into significant errors over time. He learned to work in shade, to shield his astrolabes and quadrants from direct light, to make corrections for temperature effects, understanding that precision required accounting for every factor, including the invisible expansion and contraction of the tools themselves. Every observation had to account for the physical reality of the plateau's climate, had to incorporate corrections that transformed simple measurement into a complex negotiation between ideal conditions and actual circumstances. When the Mongols finally came to Nishapur, the destruction was catastrophic, exceeding even the darkest predictions of those scholars who had anticipated violence. Libraries burned, their precious manuscripts feeding flames that illuminated the night sky with the funeral pyre of accumulated knowledge. Scholars fled or died, some killed deliberately, others simply caught in the general slaughter, their special status meaning nothing to soldiers who made no distinction between the learned and the ignorant. The intellectual flowering that had made Nishapur famous withered in blood and ash, years of scholarship erased in days of systematic destruction. Nasir survived through a combination of luck and strategic retreat, finding refuge with the Ismaili fortress state at a moment when any delay might have meant death. He left behind friends, teachers, a network of relationships that had sustained his work, carrying only what manuscripts he could protect and the knowledge he held in his mind. The journey to Ismaili territory took him through landscapes transformed by war, past burned villages and abandoned roads, through a world that seemed to be unmaking itself. The Ismaili strongholds were scattered through mountainous regions, Alamut the most famous among them, a fortress whose name would become legendary, synonymous with both intellectual sophistication and political resistance. Nasir spent years in these fortresses, officially a prisoner, though treated more as an honored guest, his status ambiguous in ways that reflected the complex politics of the time. He continued his studies, wrote treatises, engaged with the Ismaili scholars in theological debates that were sometimes friendly and sometimes tense, representing different interpretations of Islam's fundamental truths. The fortresses provided both sanctuary and constraint, protecting him from external dangers while limiting his freedom, a trade-off whose terms he accepted because the alternatives were worse. The mountain fortresses offered relief from summer heat that Nasir had not experienced before, altitude providing what architecture could only approximate. built at elevations where air temperatures dropped significantly, surrounded by pine forests that provided shade and released a cool fragrance, cooled by mountain streams whose music filled the courtyards. These places demonstrated how geography could shape comfort, how the same sun that punished the lowlands might be rendered almost gentle at sufficient height. Nasir noticed these details with the attention he brought to astronomical observations, incorporated them into his thinking about how humans might better inhabit their environment, began to formulate principles about the relationship between elevation, climate, and human flourishing. But he also observed the trade-offs that made simple solutions impossible. The fortresses were isolated, difficult to supply, vulnerable to siege, their defensive advantages purchased at the cost of connection to the broader world. Comfort required sacrifice of other values, accessibility, the free flow of ideas and goods, the interchange that made intellectual life vibrant rather than stagnant. He wondered about balance, about optimal solutions, whether any configuration of human settlement could maximize all desirable qualities, or whether every choice necessarily involved losses as well as gains. These were not merely theoretical questions, but practical concerns that shaped daily life, determining what books might arrive, which scholars might visit, how ideas circulated or stagnated. When the Mongols finally conquered the Ismaili fortresses, Nasir's life entered a new phase whose terms he could not have predicted. The Mongol commander, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, had unusual respect for learning, an interest in astronomy and philosophy that distinguished him from purely military commanders. He spared scholars he found useful, incorporating them into his court, recognizing that conquest required not just military victory, but administrative sophistication. Nasir became one such scholar, transitioning from prisoner to valued servant of the very forces that had destroyed his earlier world. The moral complexity of this transition did not escape him, though he rarely spoke of it directly. He had witnessed the Mongol destruction of Nishapur, had seen libraries burn, had mourned colleagues killed by soldiers, now nominally his allies. Yet survival required accommodation, required accepting patronage from those whose hands were stained with the blood of friends and teachers. He made this accommodation, justified it to himself as necessary for the preservation of knowledge, for the continuation of work that transcended individual loyalties. Whether this constituted wisdom or merely rationalization remained a question he turned over in private moments, finding no entirely satisfying answer. Hulagu Khan tasked him with building an observatory, a proper facility for astronomical observation and calculation that would serve both scientific and astrological purposes, both the search for truth and the practical need for predictions about propitious times for military campaigns. This commission shaped Nasir's mature years, gave him a project of sufficient scope to absorb his energies and ambitions. He would design and oversee the construction of the Maragheh observatory, one of the most sophisticated scientific installations of its era, a monument to the possibility that knowledge might flourish even under the patronage of conquest. The site selection process revealed Nasir's accumulated understanding of climate and comfort, his years of experience with how environment shaped intellectual work. He surveyed multiple locations around Maragheh, evaluating not just astronomical considerations, clear skies, minimal light pollution, stable foundations that would not shift and invalidate careful calibrations, but also practical concerns about heat, wind, water access, all the factors that would determine whether the observatory could function during the punishing summer months. He rejected several sites that offered better astronomical conditions but worse climate management, understanding that the best theoretical location meant nothing if human observers could not sustain work there. He chose a location on a hillside where prevailing breezes flowed consistently, where the slope itself created air movement that would provide some relief from stagnant heat. He designed the main observation hall with a high ceiling and strategically placed windows to create air circulation, openings positioned to catch wind from multiple directions and channel it through the interior spaces. He incorporated a wind tower into the design, though this required convincing skeptical builders that such Persian features belonged in a Mongol-sponsored institution, that traditional architectural wisdom should not be abandoned simply because the patron came from a different culture. The builders initially resisted, arguing that Mongol structures should reflect Mongol preferences, but Nasir persisted, explaining the physics of airflow and cooling with such clarity that even those predisposed to disagreement found themselves persuaded. The observatory's water supply came from a qanat, similar to those serving the town below, underground channels that carried water from distant sources while protecting it from evaporation. Nasir designed a system where this water could flow through channels in the building's walls, providing evaporative cooling as air passed over the wet surfaces. The effect was subtle but measurable, a few degrees difference that made summer work sessions tolerable rather than impossible, that extended the hours when precise observation remained feasible. He calculated the optimal flow rate, the ideal placement of channels, the best materials for the walls to maximize evaporative effects without creating humidity that would blur visibility. His quarters within the observatory complex reflected both his elevated status and his understanding of comfort, demonstrating how theoretical knowledge could be applied to practical living. A two-room suite on the north side of the building, thick-walled to resist heat penetration, with a private wind tower and a small reflecting pool in the attached courtyard that served both aesthetic and cooling purposes. Not luxurious by palace standards, but carefully designed with attention to the principles he had learned through years of adaptation and observation. Every detail served multiple purposes, combining functionality with the modest beauty that satisfied his intellectual appreciation for efficiency. Summer evenings he would sit in this courtyard after observations concluded, listening to the fountain's gentle splash, feeling the temperature differential between the cooled courtyard and the surrounding night, his body registering what his mind understood as the product of careful planning. Here he would write, drafting treatises on astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, his pen moving steadily across pages while the stars emerged overhead. The courtyard became his sanctuary, a space where the day's heat slowly dissipated and thought could flow freely again, unimpeded by physical distraction. His most famous work from this period, the Ziji-Ilkhani, astronomical tables of unprecedented accuracy, required years of patient observation and calculation, a project whose scope dwarfed any individual contribution. Every clear night his team would track celestial positions, record measurements, note anomalies, building a database that would eventually allow them to predict planetary positions with remarkable precision. The work could not pause for summer, could not simply be suspended during the months when observation was most difficult. So strategies for heat management became crucial to the entire enterprise. Success depended not just on mathematical sophistication, but on the mundane business of keeping observers functional during conditions that pushed human endurance. He trained his assistants in the same techniques he had learned over decades, working in shade, using dampened cloths to cool instruments, taking breaks during peak heat, when even the most dedicated observers' accuracy declined, resuming observations after sunset when the air settled and visibility improved. The observatory's design helped, its architectural features providing advantages that individual will could not overcome, but human adaptation remained essential. No building could entirely eliminate the challenge of summer. It could only reduce that challenge to manageable proportions, creating conditions where discipline and determination might succeed. Nasir observed that accuracy improved on cooler nights, a correlation so consistent that it could not be dismissed as coincidence. Temperature fluctuations affected both instruments and human perception, introduced errors that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. He began to wonder about seasonal corrections, about whether observations made in summer required different analysis than those made in winter, whether the tables themselves should somehow account for the conditions under which data had been gathered. These questions opened new lines of inquiry, suggested that the pursuit of astronomical accuracy required understanding not just the heavens, but also the earthly conditions of observation. The work consumed him, but also sustained him, provided purpose that transcended the immediate difficulties of daily existence. In the systematic tracking of celestial movements, he found order, predictability, beauty, qualities often absent from human affairs with their chaos and violence and unpredictability. The stars cared nothing for earthly heat or human discomfort, for political intrigue or military conquest. They followed their paths with perfect indifference, and he found this comforting, found in their regularity a kind of constancy that grounded him even as the world around him remained unstable. Politically, he remained in a delicate position, his usefulness to Hulagu Khan providing protection but not security, his status dependent on continued patronage that could be withdrawn. He navigated court politics carefully, maintaining his scholarly independence while fulfilling his patrons' expectations, performing the astrological consultations that were demanded while pursuing the astronomical research that genuinely interested him. It required a different kind of endurance than physical heat, a constant vigilance and calculation about what could be said, what must remain private, how to preserve intellectual integrity while accommodating power. The strain of this balancing act sometimes exceeded the strain of summer itself. He witnessed the Mongol siege of Baghdad in 1258, one of history's great catastrophes, a destruction so total that its reverberations would be felt for centuries. The destruction of the House of Wisdom, the slaughter of scholars, the burning of manuscripts. These losses wounded him deeply, reopened the trauma of Nishapur's fall, reminded him that knowledge remained always vulnerable to forces that valued it not at all. He tried to save what he could, convincing Hulagu to spare certain texts and scholars, arguing that some knowledge deserved preservation even by the standards of conquest. His influence had limits. His persuasion succeeded only partially. But he did what he could and lived afterward with the knowledge that it had not been enough. After Baghdad's fall, Nasir's position became more secure, his status elevated by his very rarity. He was now the preeminent scholar in the Mongol court, his observatory the intellectual center of the region, a beacon that attracted students and scholars from distances that would have been unthinkable before the Mongol conquests created new patterns of movement and patronage. Students came from distant cities to study under him, drawn by his reputation, by the opportunity to work at a facility whose resources exceeded anything available elsewhere. His reputation spread across the Islamic world and beyond, reaching scholars in Byzantium and eventually Europe, his name becoming synonymous with astronomical precision and philosophical sophistication. In his 50s, he began to suffer from the accumulated effects of age and climate, the gradual wearing down that claimed even those who had adapted most successfully. His eyes, strained from years of night observation and manuscript copying, weakened, making the precise work he had always demanded of himself increasingly difficult. His joints ached more in the heat, pain that had been occasional becoming chronic, mornings requiring a period of careful movement before his body would respond with its former fluidity. The same summer temperatures he had endured in youth now left him exhausted in ways that no amount of rest seemed to remedy, his reserves of strength depleted by decades of sustained effort. He designed additional cooling features for his quarters, modifications that reflected both his deteriorating condition and his continued intellectual creativity. A deeper wind tower with more directional control, allowing him to fine-tune airflow based on wind direction and intensity. A subterranean chamber accessed through his courtyard, where the temperature remained nearly constant year-round, a space that temperature fluctuations could not penetrate. This chamber became his summer refuge, a place to work when surface heat grew unbearable, when even the carefully designed coolness of his rooms proved insufficient. The chamber's walls were limestone, smooth and cool to the touch, their thermal mass maintaining stable temperatures regardless of what occurred above. He would descend the narrow stairs with a lamp, manuscripts, writing tools, and spend hours in that dim coolness, the outside world reduced to distant abstraction. The air was heavy but still, carrying the faint mineral smell of stone and earth, the temperature perhaps 15 degrees lower than the surface, enough difference to transform working conditions. His thinking sharpened in this environment, benefited from the removal of constant thermal distraction, from the body's quiet gratitude at being allowed to simply exist without struggle. He wrote some of his most important philosophical works in that underground chamber, producing texts that would influence Islamic thought for generations. The isolation, the constant temperature, the removal from daily distractions, all contributed to a clarity of thought that surface conditions made difficult to achieve. He began to see connections between his astronomical work and his philosophical speculation, between the perfection of celestial mechanics and the imperfection of earthly existence, developing arguments about the relationship between mathematical order and divine purpose. The chamber became not just a refuge, but a kind of philosophical laboratory, a controlled environment where thought could develop without interruption. Summer afternoons, when the heat was truly overwhelming, he would gather his closest students in the chamber and lecture on the unity of knowledge, on the ways that different disciplines ultimately addressed the same fundamental questions. Mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, theology, all different approaches to understanding divine creation, different languages describing the same underlying reality. His voice would echo slightly off the stone walls, giving his words a strange authority, as though the earth itself endorsed his arguments. The students would sit on cushions arranged in a semicircle, taking notes, asking questions, engaging in the dialogue that Nasir believed was essential to genuine learning rather than mere memorization. His wife managed their household with practiced efficiency, a partner whose contribution to his work remained largely invisible but absolutely essential. She understood his work's importance, protected his time, ensured the domestic sphere ran smoothly so that he could focus on observations and calculations and writing without being constantly pulled into mundane concerns. She too felt the summer's weight but rarely complained, at least not to him, maintained the household routines that created stability. He appreciated this support more than he expressed, his gratitude implicit in his reliance but seldom articulated, a failure of communication that was typical of his generation and culture. They had no children, which brought both relief and sadness, emotions that coexisted without resolution. Relief because scholars' lives were unstable, the times dangerous. Children would have been hostages to fortune in an era when fortune dealt harshly with the vulnerable. Sadness because the future would contain no direct continuity, no inheritor of his accumulated wisdom, no one who would carry his name and perhaps his talents forward. His legacy would have to be his works, his influence extending through students and books rather than blood, a pattern that had advantages but also felt like a kind of incompleteness. As he entered his 60s, his health declined noticeably, the gradual deterioration accelerating into something more alarming. The heat that had once been merely uncomfortable now felt dangerous, threatening, as though his body's regulatory mechanisms were failing and could no longer maintain the necessary balance. His heart would race after minimal exertion, his breathing grew labored in the thickest heat, his color would fade alarmingly. He began to fear that he would not complete his planned works, that death would interrupt projects still unfinished, leaving his intellectual legacy incomplete in ways that troubled him deeply. He pushed himself harder in response to this fear, working longer hours in his cool chamber, dictating to scribes when his hand cramped too severely to write, his voice carrying sentences that assistants would transcribe and later read back to him for corrections. The astronomical tables needed final revisions, incorporating the most recent observations, refining predictions to eliminate remaining errors. The philosophical treatises needed completion, arguments that existed in fragmentary form required full development, ideas sketched in notebooks needed transformation into polished prose. Time was running out and he felt its pressure as he had never felt summer's heat, an urgency that drove him despite his body's protests. In the summer of 1274, the heat was particularly brutal, temperatures reaching extremes that exceeded even the plateau's usual punishing standards. Even the underground chamber felt oppressive, its usual coolness compromised by the sustained intensity of heat that penetrated deeper than normal, that found its way through stone and earth. His body weakened day by day, his strength ebbing in ways that frightened his wife and students. He continued working until he could not, until even dictation became impossible, until consciousness itself became intermittent. In his final days, he dictated his final thoughts to a faithful student, instructions about which manuscripts should be preserved, which observations should be prioritized for inclusion in the tables, making peace with incompletion. He died in June, at the height of summer, in the city that had become his home after so many displacements. The timing seemed somehow appropriate, as though summer had finally claimed him after a lifetime of negotiation. His funeral was attended by scholars, officials, common townspeople who had heard of his fame and felt that they owed respect to the man who had brought distinction to their city. They buried him quickly as the heat demanded, as custom required, the interment completed before the body could deteriorate in summer's heat. Then mourners retreated to shade and memory, to the traditional rituals of remembrance that would continue for days, sharing stories of his accomplishments, his character, his generosity to students. His observatory continued operating for years after his death, his students maintaining the observational program with dedication that honored his memory, refining the astronomical tables he had left incomplete. But the energy gradually dissipated as students aged or dispersed, as patronage became uncertain with changing political fortunes, as the infrastructure slowly degraded without his guiding vision. Eventually the institution declined, observations becoming less frequent, less systematic, until finally they ceased altogether. The physical structure remained, slowly weathering under the same sun that had challenged Nasir throughout his life, stones crumbling incrementally back toward the earth. His work survived better than his buildings, demonstrating the superiority of knowledge over physical structures when it came to endurance. The manuscripts were copied and recopied, translated into multiple languages, carried across continents by traders and travelers and scholars. His astronomical tables influenced European scholars centuries later, contributing to the revolution in understanding that would eventually overturn the ancient cosmology entirely. His philosophical writings shaped Islamic thought for generations, his arguments about the unity of knowledge and the relationship between reason and faith continuing to provoke debate long after their author had died. Looking back across his life, certain patterns emerge with clarity that individual moments obscured. The constant negotiation with climate, working around heat, designing spaces for comfort, adapting schedules and methods to accommodate the body's limits, formed a continuous thread through decades. The integration of practical and theoretical concerns revealed itself as characteristic of his approach. Astronomy required physical observations, observations required habitable spaces required architectural solutions required understanding of physics and engineering, everything connected, knowledge serving practice serving knowledge, in a cycle that admitted no artificial boundaries between disciplines. He lived at the intersection of worlds, Persian and Mongol, religious and secular, theoretical and practical, navigating boundaries that others experienced as absolute divisions. He navigated these boundaries carefully, taking from each what served his purpose, synthesizing elements that others kept separate, demonstrating that intellectual work need not be constrained by cultural categories. And always, underneath everything, the reality of summer on the plateau, the physical context that shaped every choice and limited every possibility. Climate was not background, but participant in his story, not mere setting, but active force that had to be constantly engaged. His legacy includes not just his calculations and treatises, but his example of persistent intellectual work despite physical discomfort, the demonstration that serious scholarship could flourish in harsh climates if one designed the right supports. He showed that success required architectural solutions, social arrangements, institutional frameworks, that individual brilliance alone was insufficient without supporting structures. The observatory itself embodied this principle, its wind towers and water channels and underground chambers representing the material infrastructure that enabled abstract thought. Knowledge required not just minds but bodies, and bodies required conditions that allowed them to function. The wind tower he incorporated into the observatory still stood decades after his death, its vanes turning in the same breezes he had studied and harnessed, a monument to his understanding that human comfort was a legitimate concern for serious scholars. Travelers passing through Maragheh would point to it, tell stories of the great scholar who had lived and worked there, the man whose observations had achieved unprecedented accuracy, whose philosophical arguments had influenced scholars across continents. The structure became legend before it became ruin, its physical decay unable to erase the stories that had accumulated around it. In considering Nasir's life, we see the scholar's version of summer endurance, intellectual work, as a form of resistance against climate that sought to render thought impossible. Different from the craftsman's physical labor, yes, but sharing the same fundamental challenge, the same requirement to persist when conditions argued for surrender. How to continue meaningful work when the body suffers, when the environment resists, when simple comfort remains always just out of reach. This question united the learned and the laboring, the philosopher and the builder. He succeeded through intelligence, privilege, and stubborn persistence, three factors that operated in combination rather than isolation. He had resources the craftsman lacked: wealth for architectural modifications, social position for access to patronage, knowledge to design optimal solutions, advantages that cannot be dismissed or minimized. Yet he too sweated, suffered, adapted, his privilege reducing but not eliminating the challenge. The plateau's summer humbled even the greatest minds, reminded even those with every advantage that human life occurred within limits that no amount of learning could completely transcend. His astronomical work connected him to something beyond heat and hardship, provided meaning that made endurance possible rather than merely necessary. The stars in their courses, the mathematical perfection of orbital mechanics, the divine order underlying apparent chaos, these gave purpose to discomfort, transformed suffering from meaningless imposition to acceptable cost. He endured summer because the work mattered more than comfort, because understanding the celestial realm justified the difficulties of earthly existence. His observations would outlast his life, his tables would guide navigators and calendar makers, his knowledge would accumulate and compound and contribute to the broader human project of understanding the cosmos. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson from his life, the insight that emerges from following his story through decades of heat and observation and writing, that humans can transcend physical suffering when purpose pulls them forward, when work connects to values that exceed immediate comfort. Not that suffering becomes less real, not that pain ceases to register, or heat stops draining strength, but that it becomes bearable, becomes fuel rather than obstacle. Nasir transformed summer's weight into intellectual achievement, alchemy that required no magic but only determination and the conviction that knowledge justified its cost. His story concludes, but does not end, continues in the manuscripts that circulate still, in the astronomical techniques that descended from his innovations, in the architectural principles he demonstrated. The man died in June of 1274, overcome by heat and age, his body failing at last in its long negotiation with summer. But the work persists, carried forward by others who build on foundations he helped establish, who benefit from his patient observations and careful calculations. In this persistence lies both his triumph and his vindication, proof that a life devoted to knowledge could achieve something worth the suffering it required. Let us drift now into a different kind of exploration, a meditation on structures and secrets, on the ingenuity that blooms in harsh landscapes. Across the Persian plateau, scattered like strange monuments to human persistence, stand the yakhchals, ice houses of ancient design, some still functional after centuries of service, others crumbling into picturesque ruin that photographers seek out in the golden hours of dawn and dusk. Imagine approaching one of these structures on a blazing summer afternoon, when the heat rises in visible waves from the earth. The structure rises from flat ground like a beehive, its dome visible from a distance of several kilometers, a shape that seems both organic and geometric at once. The walls are immensely thick, several meters of mud brick layered and plastered with precision, designed to hold back the sun's assault with sheer mass and the accumulated wisdom of generations. As you draw closer, walking across the hard-packed earth that crunches beneath your feet, details emerge with each step forward. The dome's surface is not smooth but textured with a careful pattern of ventilation holes, each one positioned with deliberate intent by builders who understood air and temperature in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. At the base, nearly hidden in shadow, a low entrance barely large enough for a person to crouch through awaits, its darkness promising relief from the unrelenting brightness outside. The whole structure emanates mystery, standing as it does in apparent defiance of the climate that surrounds it. You pause before entering, letting your eyes adjust from the brilliant exterior to the dim opening, feeling the anticipation that must have been familiar to countless visitors over the centuries. The temperature differential is immediately apparent. Cool air exhales from the entrance, tangible against your sun-heated skin, a physical sensation that announces the transition between worlds. You crouch and enter, folding yourself through the narrow opening. Inside, the passage descends at a gentle angle, the ceiling low enough that you must walk bent at the waist, your shoulders hunched forward in a posture of submission to the architecture. The walls are stone here, different from the brick above, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hands, steadying themselves in the darkness. Your footsteps echo strangely in the confined space, the sound bouncing between close walls in patterns that disorient. The air grows noticeably cooler with each step downward, the temperature dropping degree by degree until the heat of the surface world becomes a memory rather than a presence. The transition is gradual but profound, a descent not just through space but through temperature zones, through layers of carefully engineered climate control. The passage opens into the main chamber, and you straighten slowly, cautiously, looking up into darkness that seems to extend forever. The chamber is a pit really, cylindrical in form, descending far below ground level into the cool embrace of the earth itself. What you entered on was not ground level at all, but the elevated rim of this pit, the dome rising above, while the storage chamber extends deep into earth, creating a vertical space of remarkable dimensions. Your eyes adjust slowly to the dimness, pupils dilating to capture what light exists. Shafts of illumination filter through the ventilation holes in the dome, creating shifting patterns on the curved walls that move as the sun traces its path across the sky outside. The geometry is elegant, the dome's curve calculated with mathematical precision to maximize volume while minimizing surface area, reducing heat transfer through principles that modern engineers would recognize and admire. Every element serves function, Nothing here is merely decorative or accidental. The floor of the pit lies perhaps 10 meters below where you stand on the rim, a distance that speaks to the ambition of the builders. In winter, workers would have harvested ice from mountain streams or collected snow from higher elevations, transported it here on donkeys that picked their way carefully along frozen paths, and dumped it through openings in the dome. The ice would accumulate at the bottom, packed tight by its own weight and by the labor of men with tools. Insulated by the earth that surrounded the pit and by the structure's massive walls, the ice would remain solid through seasons when ice should not exist. Through summer, merchants would come, descend by ladder or stairs cut into the stone, chip off portions of ice with picks designed for the purpose, transport it to wealthy households where it would be received like treasure. The ice would last months, sometimes through the entire hot season when temperatures outside remained unbearable. But how exactly did the system work with such reliability? What made it so effective when, by all logic, ice should have melted within days of summer's arrival? Archaeologists studying these structures have proposed several mechanisms, each supported by evidence and calculation. The thick walls provide obvious insulation, creating a barrier between the stored ice and the heat of the day that never fully penetrates. But the geometry matters too, perhaps even more than the simple thickness of the walls. The dome shape minimizes the ratio of surface area to volume, meaning less exposure to heat per unit of stored ice. The underground component places the storage below the frost line, where earth temperatures remain relatively constant throughout the year, hovering in a range that preserves rather than destroys. These are strategies that work with nature rather than against it, using the Earth's own properties as tools. But there are subtler elements that reveal themselves only through careful study. The ventilation holes in the dome are not randomly placed but follow patterns related to air circulation, to the physics of convection, and the behavior of gases at different temperatures. Warm air rises and escapes through upper vents, while cooler air is drawn in through lower openings, creating a gradient that maintains itself. This creates a gentle but constant circulation that actually helps maintain low temperatures rather than compromising them. The air movement is imperceptible to human senses but measurable with instruments, a steady flow that prevents stagnation and manages moisture. The system breathes in its way, inhaling and exhaling in rhythms dictated by temperature and pressure. Some yakhchals incorporate wind towers, badgers, into their design, adding another layer of sophistication to the cooling strategy. These vertical shafts catch prevailing breezes and direct them into the ice chamber with remarkable efficiency. The moving air prevents warm pockets from forming, maintains circulation throughout the space, helps manage the small amount of meltwater that inevitably accumulates despite all precautions. The meltwater management is itself ingenious, a solution to a problem that could have undermined the entire system. Channels cut into the floor of the pit drain water away from the ice mass, preventing it from pooling and accelerating melting through contact. These channels lead to underground passages that carry the water away, sometimes toward the town's qanat system, where it rejoins the water supply, nothing wasted. In the yakhchal you currently stand in, let us say, it is one near Yazd, partially ruined but still structurally sound enough to explore safely. The drainage channels are visible as dark grooves in the stone floor. You can trace their path with your eyes, following them toward the shadows where they disappear into passages too small to follow. Imagining water trickling along them, the system quietly functioning century after century with no human intervention required, brings a sense of admiration for the minds that conceived such efficiency. But mysteries remain, questions that archaeologists debate, and that evidence has not conclusively answered. Some yakhchals seem oversized for their community's needs, their capacity far exceeding what the local population could have consumed. Were they commercial operations, serving multiple towns and creating networks of ice distribution that we have not yet mapped? Others are found in locations where ice harvesting would have been difficult, far from mountains or reliable water sources. Did they rely on transported snow hauled from distant peaks, or were there techniques we have not reconstructed? The orientation of these structures follows patterns that are not fully understood, despite decades of study. Most face north, which makes intuitive sense for minimizing sun exposure on the entrance and main walls, but some deviate from this principle, facing east or west, or directions that seem arbitrary, and the reasons are unclear. Were they adapting to local topography, working with the contours of the land? Were they accounting for prevailing wind patterns that differed from regional norms? Or were there factors we can no longer perceive? Cultural considerations, religious requirements, practical constraints that have left no trace? Archaeological excavations have found interesting details that complicate our understanding further. In the fill layers of collapsed yakhchals, researchers discover straw mixed with the ice, insulation layered between ice blocks to slow melting, adding an organic component to the thermal management system. They find channels lined with glazed ceramic tiles, reducing friction and water absorption while adding durability to surfaces subjected to constant moisture. They find evidence of maintenance rituals, of periodic cleaning and repair that kept these structures functioning across generations. Tools left behind in chambers, marks on walls that indicate measurement systems, remnants of torches or lamps that provided light for workers in the depths. These fragments speak to the human presence that animated these spaces, to the labor that sustained them. One site near Kerman revealed something unexpected, something that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The yakhchal there connected to a series of underground chambers that extended far beyond the ice storage pit, rooms carved from living rock with no obvious connection to the ice storage function. These chambers had no clear purpose, too elaborate for simple storage, too remote from the surface to be living spaces, too carefully constructed to be mere accidents of excavation. The excavators speculated about religious significance, about ritual cooling practices that might have been part of now forgotten belief systems. But evidence remained frustratingly incomplete, offering hints but no conclusions. The chambers stand empty now, their purposes lost to time, their silence absolute. Temperature measurements in intact yakhchals reveal remarkable performance that validates the builder's genius. Even on days when surface temperatures exceed 40 degrees Celsius, when the air shimmers with heat and the ground is too hot to touch, the interior of the pit remains below 10 degrees. Some measurements record temperatures near freezing, sustained by the mass of ice and the efficiency of the insulation, creating winter in the heart of summer. But the human experience of these spaces is difficult to reconstruct from measurements and artifacts alone. We know from written records that wealthy families sent servants to retrieve ice, that this ice was used to cool drinks and make sharbats, preserve food during feasts, provide medical relief for fever victims. We know there was a whole economy around ice, harvesting, transport, storage, distribution, pricing, that created livelihoods and hierarchies. But what did it feel like to descend into these chambers on a scorching day, stepping from brutal heat into sudden cold? The silence would have been profound after the constant noise of the surface world, the temperature shift disorienting to a body calibrated to summer's extremes, perhaps a moment of dizziness as the body adjusted, as blood vessels constricted and skin prickled with goosebumps. The dim light would have forced eyes to work hard, shapes resolving slowly from darkness. The damp air would have carried the mineral smell of wet stone and the faint freshness of the ice itself. The sense of being enclosed in earth while the sun raged above would have been both comforting and unsettling, a temporary escape that emphasized, rather than erased, the reality of the climate outside. The actual act of chipping ice from the mass would have been physical labor performed in cold, muscles working while breath misted in the air. Knowing heat waited outside would have added urgency. The ice must be retrieved quickly, wrapped in insulating materials, transported before it could melt. Every action would have been practiced, efficient, the result of procedures refined over years of repetition. Some accounts from medieval travelers mention these ice houses with wonder bordering on disbelief. One Persian poet describes entering a yakhchal as passing from fire into winter's embrace, from the sun's hammer into night's cool chamber, language that captures both the physical sensation and the psychological impact. Another writes of ice as captured winter, imprisoned for summer's relief, a defiance of season and sense, recognizing the fundamental strangeness of the achievement. But we also hear about accidents, about the dangers inherent in these structures despite their careful construction. Stories tell of workers injured when ice masses shifted unexpectedly, their weight suddenly redistributing and crushing whatever stood in the path. There was constant danger of structural failure, of walls weakening or cracks spreading unnoticed, until catastrophe struck. The domes, despite their thickness and careful engineering, could crack under their own weight or from water infiltration that froze and expanded. Collapses were not common, but neither were they unknown, and each one would have been a disaster. Workers killed, ice destroyed, investment lost. The ruins we see today are often the results of such failures, structures that could not be repaired or were abandoned after tragedy. The wind towers, badgers that often accompany yakhchals, are their own source of fascination. Structures that seem simple at first glance but reveal complexity upon study. These towers rise sometimes 20 meters into the air, square or octagonal in plan, their vertical shafts divided into channels by internal walls. At the top, openings face multiple directions, catching wind from any quarter, regardless of seasonal changes in weather patterns. The physics of wind towers involves principles of convection and pressure differentials that architects today study with computer models. Wind hitting one side of the tower creates positive pressure, forcing air down into the building below with measurable force. Simultaneously, the lee side experiences negative pressure, drawing air up and out through the opposite channels, creating a circuit that continues as long as any breeze blows. The result is circulation even when the wind is light or variable, when it seems insufficient to move air through a building. Inside the tower's shaft, the air picks up speed as it descends, compressed by the narrowing channel, creating a cooling breeze that flows through the spaces below with surprising force. If the tower connects to underground chambers or to a yakhchal, this breeze carries the coolness of those spaces, distributing it through the building in a carefully managed flow. The effect is subtle but cumulative, a few degrees of temperature reduction that makes the difference between comfort and distress. Different designs optimize for different conditions, each adapted to the specific challenges of its location. In regions where wind is strong and consistent, simpler two-directional towers suffice, with channels facing only the prevailing direction and its opposite. In areas with variable winds where seasons bring breezes from different quarters, more complex multi-directional designs become necessary. Some towers incorporate internal baffles that redirect airflow, creating turbulence that enhances cooling through principles of fluid dynamics. The complexity of these internal structures is often invisible from the outside, hidden within the tower's mass. The construction of wind towers required specialized knowledge passed down through generations of builders, a craft tradition that was carefully guarded. The proportions matter immensely. Too tall, and the structure becomes unstable, vulnerable to wind that it's meant to harness. Too short, and it fails to catch sufficient breeze, remaining below the turbulent boundary layer where air moves with too much chaos to be useful. The shaft dimensions affect airspeed and volume, creating trade-offs between velocity and quantity that must be balanced. The orientation must account for prevailing patterns while remaining functional in all conditions, a challenging requirement when winds shift with seasons. Walking through an old neighborhood in Yazd, You see wind towers rising from nearly every substantial house, their forms as distinctive as signatures. They vary in size and design but share common principles, creating family resemblances that speak to shared knowledge and local traditions. Together they create a distinctive skyline, a forest of square towers against the sky that gives the city its characteristic silhouette. From a distance, the city looks like a collection of chimneys, but they draw in rather than expel, inverting the familiar logic of ventilation. Closer inspection reveals the sophistication, the carefully proportioned openings, the internal divisions just visible in the shadows, the materials chosen for their thermal properties. Inside houses with wind towers, the effect is immediately noticeable, even to visitors unfamiliar with the technology. Even on hot days, there is movement in the air, a gentle flow that prevents stagnation and the oppressive stillness that can make heat unbearable. The temperature may be only marginally lower than outside, perhaps only 2 or 3 degrees, but the psychological impact of moving air is significant. It feels more tolerable, less oppressive, allows the body's natural cooling mechanisms to function. Some houses combine wind towers with other cooling strategies, creating integrated systems that work together. A reflecting pool in the courtyard adds evaporative cooling. The water's surface releases moisture into the air, which then absorbs heat energy to evaporate that moisture, lowering temperature through thermodynamic exchange. The wind tower draws this cooled air into the house, distributing it through rooms where families gather during the heat of the day. Other houses route the wind tower's airflow through underground chambers before it enters living spaces, adding another stage of cooling. The earth cools the air as it passes through these subterranean passages, so by the time it emerges into the house, it may be several degrees lower than ambient, genuinely comfortable rather than merely tolerable. This creates an environment without any mechanical input, no fuel consumed, no noise generated, just the patient operation of natural laws harnessed through design. But access to these technologies was profoundly uneven, divided along lines of wealth and social status. Constructing a wind tower was expensive, requiring skilled labor that commanded high wages and quality materials that had to be sourced from distant quarries. Maintaining it required ongoing expense. The vanes needed periodic replacement as weather eroded them, the shaft needed cleaning when birds nested or debris accumulated. Structural repairs could be major undertakings requiring scaffolding and expert masons. Only the relatively wealthy could afford such features, creating a thermal hierarchy that paralleled economic stratification. For the poor, simpler strategies had to suffice, methods that helped but could not match the effectiveness of purpose-built structures. Damp mats hung in doorways provided evaporative cooling, though they required constant re-wetting and blocked light. Thick curtains blocked sun but also blocked air, creating stuffy interiors. Strategic opening and closing of windows to manage airflow required vigilance and understanding, and even then provided limited relief. Sleeping on roofs was common during summer months, families carrying bedding up narrow stairs each evening and descending before dawn. These methods helped but could not match the effectiveness of a well-designed wind tower, could not create the genuinely comfortable environment that wealth could purchase. The differential shaped daily experience in profound ways, affecting sleep quality, work capacity, health outcomes. The archaeological evidence suggests that wind tower technology evolved over centuries, not emerging fully formed but developing through experimentation. Early designs were simpler, less efficient, using basic principles but without the refinements that would come later. Over time, builders experimented, testing different heights and shaft dimensions, observing which designs worked better in which conditions. Knowledge accumulated through trial and error, through careful observation of performance and systematic refinement of technique. Successful innovations spread through networks of builders, while failures were abandoned or modified. Some of the most sophisticated wind towers date from the Safavid period in the 16th and 17th centuries, the culmination of centuries of accumulated wisdom. These incorporate mathematical precision in their proportions, careful consideration of aerodynamics that predates formal fluid dynamics. Integration with other building systems reflects holistic thinking about architecture as climate management. They represent the peak of the tradition, structures that embody generations of learning distilled into built form. But then the tradition began to decline, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. As political and economic conditions changed, as the Safavid Empire gave way to Qajar rule, and then to modern state formation, priorities shifted. As Western influences increased, bringing new architectural vocabularies and different values, the old methods seemed backward, associated with poverty and tradition rather than progress. As new building methods arrived, concrete, steel, eventually air conditioning, the need for passive cooling seemed to diminish. Wind towers continued to be built, but with less care, less understanding of the principles that made them effective. Many later examples are decorative rather than functional, their shafts too narrow or poorly oriented, their internal divisions absent or arbitrary. They signal tradition without providing its benefits, becoming symbols rather than tools. Modern studies using computational fluid dynamics have attempted to model wind tower performance, translating ancient structures into digital simulations. Researchers input architectural parameters, weather data, physical constants, and calculate expected airflows and temperatures with precision impossible in earlier eras. The results generally confirm that these structures work as claimed, that the principles are sound, though efficiency varies widely depending on specific design and conditions. Some configurations perform remarkably well, validating the builder's intuitions. Others reveal inefficiencies that suggest compromises or errors, places where theory and execution diverged. Some architects today are revisiting these traditional technologies, seeking to incorporate passive cooling into modern buildings as energy costs rise and climate concerns intensify. They study the proportions of ancient wind towers, the placement of vents, the integration with thermal mass, and other passive strategies. The goal is to reduce dependence on mechanical cooling, to design buildings that work with climate rather than against it, that use energy judiciously rather than wastefully. But recreating the performance is challenging in ways that surprise contemporary practitioners. Ancient builders had intuitive understanding developed over lifetimes of practice, knowledge embedded in their bodies as much as their minds. They could look at a site and know where to place the tower, what height to build it, how to orient the openings for optimal performance. Modern architects must learn these skills anew, must rediscover principles that were once common knowledge among craftsmen. The translation is imperfect. What was once felt must now be calculated. What was once traditional must now be innovative. The mystery deepens when we consider variations across regions, the diversity of solutions to similar problems. Wind towers in Yaz differ from those in Kerman or Kashan, each city developing distinctive styles. Each region developed variations adapted to local conditions, wind patterns specific to their geography, temperature ranges that differed by degrees that mattered, available materials that shaped possibilities, cultural preferences that influenced aesthetics. This diversity suggests independent evolution, local innovation, creative problem-solving rather than simple copying. Some researchers propose that wind tower knowledge traveled along trade routes, spreading from a single point of origin through networks of commerce and cultural exchange. Others argue for multiple independent inventions, the idea arising wherever people needed cooling in hot, arid climates and had materials to build vertically. The evidence could support either interpretation or some combination, initial invention spreading but then adapting, mutating, generating new forms. What we do know is that these structures represent a remarkable achievement by any measure. Without electricity, without mechanical fans or refrigeration, without modern materials or computer modeling, people created effective cooling systems that functioned reliably for centuries. They observed natural processes, convection, evaporation, thermal mass, pressure differentials, and harnessed them through careful design that required no external energy input beyond construction. Standing in the shadow of an ancient wind tower, as a desert breeze flows across its top, you can feel the air moving past you, drawn by pressures and temperatures into patterns the builders understood intuitively. The technology is elegant in its simplicity, requiring no moving parts, no maintenance beyond periodic cleaning. Yet it is sophisticated in its execution, every dimension and angle calculated to work together, mysterious in its accumulated wisdom that we still struggle to fully decode. And yet, for all our study, something remains elusive, just beyond our grasp. The feel of these spaces to their original inhabitants, the daily experience of living with these systems, the subtle ways they shaped behavior and expectations, these we can only approximate through imagination and inference. We can measure temperatures and calculate airflow, but we cannot fully recover the lived experience, the taken-for-granted familiarity that made these technologies invisible in their ubiquity. The yakhchals slowly crumble, time and neglect taking their toll on structures that once seemed permanent. The wind towers gradually decay, their tops crumbling, their shafts filling with debris. Some are preserved as tourist attractions, maintained by governments or cultural organizations, explained with plaques and guided tours that try to convey significance. Others sit abandoned, known only to locals, waiting for the attention of archaeologists who may never come. Each year, some are lost to development, demolished to make way for modern construction that values the land beneath more than the history above. The loss is gradual but cumulative, each structure that falls representing knowledge that becomes harder to reconstruct. What remains are fragments, hints, the outlines of a lost sophistication that challenges our assumptions about progress. We piece together the technical details through excavation and measurement, but we struggle to recover the human dimension, the meaning these structures held. How did it feel to live in this balance with climate, to depend on passive systems that required no fuel but demanded careful attention? To inhabit spaces designed for the body's needs rather than its wishes, spaces that worked with nature's constraints rather than attempting to overcome them entirely. The questions linger like the cool air in a yakhchal's depths, present but intangible. We stand at the entrance looking in, feeling the temperature differential, knowing something remarkable exists in the darkness below, something that deserves understanding and preservation. But to fully understand requires descending, requires immersion in experiences that can no longer be authentically recreated. Modern life has changed us, altered our expectations and tolerances in ways that make it difficult to appreciate systems that provided comfort without control. We expect immediate response, precise adjustment, conditions maintained regardless of outside weather, expectations that passive systems cannot meet even as they provide something perhaps more valuable. And so the mystery persists, gentle and tantalizing, a reminder that the past holds knowledge we have lost, even as we have gained knowledge the past could not imagine. The wind towers and ice houses whisper their secrets, standing as monuments to different ways of thinking about the relationship between human comfort and natural forces. But we must learn again how to listen, must cultivate the patience to hear what these structures have to teach. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson they offer, not specific techniques or dimensions, but an approach to problem-solving that begins with observation rather than assumption. The builders of yakhchals and badgers did not try to overcome their climate through brute force. They studied it, understood its patterns and rhythms, found ways to work within its constraints while still achieving their goals. They created systems that were sustainable not through virtue, but through necessity, that lasted centuries because they required minimal input to maintain. In our own time, as we confront challenges of climate change and resource depletion, as we search for ways to maintain comfort with less environmental impact, These ancient technologies offer more than historical curiosity. They offer alternative paradigms, different ways of conceiving the built environment's relationship to natural forces. The yakhchals still standing invite us to imagine winter stored through summer, to consider thermal mass and insulation not as modern inventions, but as ancient wisdom. The wind towers still rising above Yazda's rooftops demonstrate that air can be moved and cooled without mechanical power, that comfort need not require consumption. These lessons wait in the ruins and the intact structures alike, patient as the stone from which they're built. But time is not infinite, and the structures continue to deteriorate. Each collapse removes another source of knowledge, another example of how these systems functioned in practice. Documentation efforts race against decay, archaeologists and architects working to record dimensions, materials, construction techniques before they vanish. Digital models preserve information but cannot capture everything: the texture of worn stone, the way light falls through ventilation holes, the subtle acoustics of descending passages. Some organizations work to preserve intact examples, reinforcing walls, maintaining roofs, keeping the structures functional or at least stable. Others focus on education, teaching new generations about these technologies, hoping to inspire revival or adaptation. The challenge is balancing preservation with use. Structures maintained but empty become museums, losing their original purpose even as they retain their form. Yet there are experiments, contemporary buildings that attempt to revive these principles with modern materials and understanding. Architects in Iran and beyond design wind towers using steel and glass, create underground cooling chambers with concrete and insulation. The results are mixed. Some perform well, others struggle to match the efficiency of ancient examples. The learning process continues, each attempt adding to understanding even when it falls short of goals. In the end, perhaps what matters most is not perfect recreation, but sustained engagement with the ideas these structures embody. The specific dimensions of a particular yakhchal or the exact proportions of one wind tower may be less important than the underlying approach, the patient observation, the willingness to work with natural forces, the long-term thinking that creates structures serving multiple generations. These principles transcend specific forms, remaining relevant regardless of materials or construction methods. Walking away from a yakhchal as evening falls, as the air cools and the structure fades into shadow, you carry with you something more than factual knowledge. There is a feeling, difficult to articulate, of having touched something profound, a different way of inhabiting the world, a different relationship between human need and environmental reality. The structure behind you continues its patient work, insulating, circulating, managing temperatures through processes that require no human intervention. It stands as it has for centuries, a monument not to conquest of nature but to collaboration with it, not to power over climate but to intelligence working within climate's constraints. In this collaboration lies wisdom we are only beginning to appreciate again, lessons that ancient builders learned through necessity and that we must relearn through choice. The yakhchals and badgers wait, their secrets available to those willing to descend into darkness, to stand in the cool and contemplate what human ingenuity can achieve when it observes carefully and builds patiently. Their silence speaks volumes to those who listen, offering an alternative narrative to stories of progress through domination. They suggest that sophistication can lie in simplicity, that effectiveness need not require complexity, that the most sustainable solutions often work with nature's patterns rather than against them. These lessons echo in the cool air of ancient chambers, in the breeze flowing through tower shafts, in the patient geometry of domes that have weathered centuries. And as the night settles over the Persian plateau, as stars emerge above the ancient cities, the structures remain, weathered but enduring, damaged but dignified, slowly crumbling but still teaching. Their existence argues for different possibilities, different ways of solving the eternal human need for comfort in hostile climates. In their shadows and their sunlit surfaces, in their depths and their heights, in their silence and their whispered lessons, they preserve knowledge that the world may yet need again. The mystery persists because it must, because some knowledge cannot be fully captured in words or measurements, because understanding these structures fully would require living with them as their builders did, not as curiosities to study, but as tools to inhabit, not as monuments to visit, but as technologies to depend upon daily. That experience is lost, but the structures themselves remain as partial records, as incomplete but invaluable archives of human adaptation and ingenuity, waiting patiently for those who will take the time to truly see what they offer. Now let us cross the town to where privilege shapes experience, where wealth purchases relief from summer's assault. The wealthy merchant's compound rises behind high walls, the palace complex sprawls across the hillside, and within these spaces a different reality unfolds. Enter through the wooden gates, heavy and carved into the Burun, the outer courtyard where business is conducted, guests received, public faces maintained. Even here the contrast with the craftsman's dwelling is immediate. The courtyard is larger, paved with stone rather than packed earth, shaded by a broad iwan, a vaulted hall open on one side. A fountain plays in the center, water arcing from a brass fixture, splashing into a wide basin. The sound itself provides psychological cooling. The sight of moving water suggests refreshment. But the effect is not merely psychological. The fountain produces measurable evaporative cooling, lowering the temperature in its immediate vicinity by several degrees. The iwan faces north, catching morning light, but avoiding the afternoon sun's direct assault. Thick carpets cover the stone floor, and cushions line the walls for reclining. During the hottest hours, the merchant and his favored guests will gather here, fanned by servants, served cool drinks, conducting their affairs in relative comfort. Beyond the Burun lies the Andarun, the inner courtyard, the private family space, forbidden to outsiders. Here the architecture becomes even more sophisticated. A second, smaller fountain, raised flower beds filled with jasmine and roses, their fragrance mixing with the scent of water. Trees planted for shade, pomegranate, fig, plane trees with their broad leaves. The living quarters surround this courtyard, two-story structures with rooms arranged for optimal climate control. The ground floor rooms have high ceilings and thick walls, staying relatively cool through thermal mass. The upper floor rooms open onto a wraparound balcony where breezes flow, where one might sleep on the hottest nights with slightly more comfort than a roof. Each room is fitted with wooden shutters that can be adjusted throughout the day. Morning light is welcomed, afternoon sun blocked. As evening approaches and temperature drops, the shutters open again to exhaust accumulated heat and draw in cooler air. This constant adjustment is the work of servants, attending to comfort as their primary duty. The merchant's summer sleeping chamber sits on the north side of the upper floor. Its window faces the courtyard fountain, capturing both visual and auditory pleasures. A wind tower rises above this chamber, its shaft terminating in an opening in the ceiling, drawing air through the room continuously. At the base of the wind tower shaft, set into the floor, is an opening to a subterranean chamber. This chamber connects to the qanat system, where water flows and air remains perpetually cool. The wind tower draws air up from this chamber, creating a flow of genuinely cooled air through the sleeping quarters. On the hottest nights, the merchant might descend to the subterranean chamber itself. Stone stairs, narrow and steep, lead down into Earth's embrace. The chamber is finished with care, plastered walls, glazed tile floors, niches for lamps. Carpets and cushions make it habitable. Here, the temperature remains nearly constant, comfortable even when surface temperatures become dangerous. The kitchen occupies a separate building across the courtyard, preventing cooking heat from warming the main residence. The kitchen itself has its own wind tower, its own strategies for managing heat. The servants who work there suffer despite these measures, but their suffering happens out of sight of the family. The bathhouse, a private hammam scaled for household use, sits at the compound's edge. Its heating system is carefully managed to provide hot water without radiating excess heat into summer air. The bath offers both cleansing and cooling. One emerges from the experience refreshed, skin clean, body temperature temporarily regulated. Water is everywhere in this compound, a display of wealth as much as a source of comfort. The fountains, the bath, the qanat connection, the channels that water the garden, all require maintenance, all carry cost, all demonstrate the family's resources. Water is life, and conspicuous use of water is power. The merchant's clothing differs from the craftsman's mainly in quality rather than design. Fine linen, expertly woven, dyed in pale colors that reflect rather than absorb heat. Multiple garments change throughout the day as each becomes damp with perspiration. A servant's work includes laundering these garments, ensuring fresh clothing is always available. Meals adapt to the season. Heavy dishes give way to lighter fare, cold soups, fresh fruits, salads, dressed with yogurt and herbs. Meat portions shrink while vegetables and grains dominate. The meal times shift too. Breakfast very early before heat builds, midday meal light and quick substantial dinner after sunset when appetite returns. The merchant's daily schedule reflects his privilege. Morning hours might be spent in the Brunner conducting business, but midday brings retreat to the coolest chamber with a book or correspondence. Afternoon rest is not a brief pause but genuine sleep, 2 or 3 hours of horizontal escape from the heat. Evening brings social activities, visits to other compounds, walks in the garden, entertainment. His wife and daughters live even more sheltered lives. They rarely venture beyond the Andarun, except for visits to other households or the public bath. Their days unfold in the garden courtyard, in the shaded rooms, in the careful maintenance of domestic order. They supervise servants, manage household supplies, occupy themselves with needlework and music. On particularly oppressive days, the family might relocate entirely to a summer house outside town. These structures, called kushks or bag-e-tabistan, sit in higher elevations or near water sources. The journey is itself uncomfortable. Travel under the sun in covered litters, but the destination offers genuine relief. The summer house is purpose-built for heat management. Open pavilions that catch every breeze, no walls to trap heat, sleeping platforms raised off the ground. A nearby stream provides both water and psychological comfort, its sound and presence affecting mood. Trees shade the structure, filtering light, transpiring moisture into the air. Here the elite family might spend weeks at a time, managing their affairs through messengers, returning to town only when business demands it. The servants travel back and forth more frequently, less able to escape their duties. The summer house offers the family ease but demands the staff's continued labor. In the palace complex, the same principles apply but at grander scale. The Shah and his court occupy vast structures with multiple courtyards, each designed for specific functions and times of day. The summer court moves through these spaces in a choreographed pattern, following shade and breeze, always seeking optimal conditions. The palace's ice house is not merely functional, but architectural statement. Its dome rises majestically, visible from throughout the palace grounds, a declaration of the Shah's power over nature itself. Inside, the ice mass is enormous, sufficient to supply the entire court through the summer. Servants descend multiple times daily, bringing up ice for cooling drinks, preserving foods, providing medical treatments. The palace wind towers are the most sophisticated in the city, their mechanisms adjusted by specialized technicians who understand the complex interactions of wind, temperature, and architecture. These towers are not just functional, but decorative, their exteriors covered in tiles forming geometric patterns, testaments to the integration of beauty and utility. Court life in summer moves at a different pace than in cooler seasons. Audiences occur early morning in the shaded Iwan, the Shah reclining on cushions while petitioners approach. Midday belongs to rest and private consultation. Evening brings entertainment in garden pavilions, music, poetry, elaborate meals served in multiple courses as the air finally cools. The privilege here is not merely access to cooling technologies but freedom from labor. The craftsman's summer is defined by necessary work despite discomfort. The elite's summer is defined by leisure within carefully controlled environments. Both groups endure the same climate, but their experiences could hardly be more different. Yet even the elite cannot fully escape. On the worst days, even palace chambers grow stifling. Even the deepest subterranean room feels warm. Even the ice house cannot produce unlimited ice. The heat is democratic in its reach, though undemocratic in its impact. The elite's anxiety about heat manifests differently than the poor's. They worry not about survival, but about maintaining standards, about whether their cooling systems will function adequately, about relative comfort compared to other elite households. Their suffering is real, but of a different order. Servants form the hidden architecture of elite comfort. For every degree of cooling the merchant or Shah enjoys, someone has labored, digging qanats, maintaining wind towers, fetching ice, adjusting shutters, fanning with palm fronds, preparing light meals. The servants themselves sleep in far less comfortable quarters, work through the hottest hours, sacrifice their own ease for their employers. Some servants are slaves, their labor compelled. Others are wage workers, their labor economically coerced. In either case, their bodies bear the cost of others' comfort. This moral dimension of pre-mechanical cooling is unavoidable. The technology was never divorced from social hierarchy. The contrast with the craftsman's life is stark. He adapts his body and schedule to heat. The elite adapt their environment, and when environment cannot be fully adapted, they command servants to create comfort through human effort. The sun shines on all, but its burden is distributed by class. Still, we should not romanticize the poor's experience or simply condemn the rich. The elite's architectural sophistication represents genuine innovation, accumulated knowledge, creative problem-solving. Wind towers and ice houses are achievements worthy of respect. That they were available mainly to the wealthy reflects the society's structure, not the technology's value. And even the wealthy cannot fully succeed. On a hot night, the merchant lies in his cool chamber, listening to the fountain, and he is more comfortable than the craftsman on his roof. But he too is warm. He too struggles to sleep. He too waits for morning breeze. The difference is degree, not kind. The palace's elaborate systems require constant vigilance. A qanat breach means no water for cooling. A wind tower malfunction means stagnant air. A servant's absence means discomfort. The infrastructure of privilege is fragile, dependent on many elements functioning correctly. One failure cascades into others. In the hierarchy of summer suffering, the elite occupy the most comfortable position. Below them are layers of increasing discomfort. Prosperous merchants, modest shopkeepers, craftsmen, laborers, slaves. Each group has access to fewer and less sophisticated cooling strategies. The gradient is smooth, but its effects are profound. Imagine a cross-section through the city on a summer afternoon. At the top of the hill, the palace sits cool in its chambers. Mid-hill, the merchants rest in their wind tower houses. Down in the market quarter, the craftsman sweats through repair work. At the city's edge, the laborers toil in full sun. And beyond the walls, the slaves work fields fully exposed, with only brief rests under temporary shelters. The same sun, the same air temperature, the same humidity, but experienced through radically different filters of architecture, wealth, and social position. Summer reveals inequality more nakedly than any other season. Winter can be escaped with sufficient clothing and fire. Summer's heat penetrates everywhere, and only elaborate measures provide relief. The elite's summer also includes leisure to reflect on their good fortune. The merchant reading poetry in his cooled chamber, the Shah listening to musicians in the garden pavilion, they have mental space that physical comfort purchases. The craftsman has no such leisure. His thoughts are occupied with water, heat, survival. This cognitive dimension of comfort matters. The elite can pursue intellectual and aesthetic pleasures because their physical needs are met by systems and servants. Their culture flourishes partially because they are not fully occupied with managing discomfort. This is not to justify inequality, but to observe its effects. The architectural heritage they leave behind is substantial. The most beautiful wind towers, the grandest ice houses, the most elegant garden pavilions, these were built for and by the elite. They represent the pinnacle of pre-mechanical cooling technology. That they were exclusive does not diminish their technical achievement. But walking through these preserved spaces today, we should remember the labor that sustained them. Every cool breeze through a wind tower was enabled by the builder's skill and the servant's maintenance. Every chip of ice represented a laborer's effort, harvesting, transporting, storing. The architecture is beautiful, but it rests on human cost. As night finally falls across the city, the different worlds begin to converge slightly. The palace chambers and the craftsman's roof both cool gradually. The elite and the poor both look at the same stars, feel the same night breeze. Sleep comes eventually to all, regardless of where they lay their heads. But morning will reveal the hierarchy again. The craftsman rises at dawn to fetch water, his body already anticipating the coming heat. The merchant wakes in his cooled chamber, takes his time, breakfasts comfortably, before beginning his day. The difference compounds over days, weeks, summers, lifetimes. In a world before air conditioning, comfort was not merely a matter of technology, but of access to technology, which meant money, which meant social position. The Persian plateau's elite did not defeat the heat, but they managed it more successfully than their poorer neighbors. This management came through architectural ingenuity applied unequally across social divides. And so we arrive at the close of our summer journey through ancient Persia, through heat and dust and the endless human effort to endure. The sun that climbed each morning over the plateau has finally set on our story, though its warmth lingers in memory and imagination. We have walked in the sandals of the young craftsman, felt the rawness of his hands and the weight of carried water. We have followed the scholar Nasir al-Din through his own negotiations with summer, his own balance of intellectual ambition and physical limitation. We have descended into the mysterious coolness of ice houses, felt the breeze through wind towers, pondered the ingenuity of passive cooling systems. We have glimpsed the palace's shaded luxury and recognized the labor hidden beneath it. All these lives, all these experiences, all these struggles and adaptations, they unfolded under the same sun that now rises over our modern world. The difference is we no longer fight the heat with thick walls and wind towers and ice harvested from mountains. We turn a dial, we press a button, and cool air flows from vents. We have won a kind of victory that ancient Persians could barely imagine. But in that victory, something has been lost too. The intimate knowledge of climate, the careful attention to breezes and shadows, the architectural intelligence that made buildings partners with environment rather than sealed capsules against it, these have faded as mechanical cooling dominated. We are more comfortable, but perhaps less connected to the rhythms that shaped human life for millennia. Tonight, as you settle into your own cool space, your bedroom with its air conditioner humming, your sheets crisp and fresh, your body temperature regulated without effort. Pause for just a moment. Imagine the mud brick walls holding back desert heat. Imagine the fountains splash in a shaded courtyard. Imagine the slow descent into an icehouse's depths, into coolness purchased by winter's labor. Imagine the craftsman on his roof watching stars wheel overhead, his mat still warm beneath him, his children sleeping near. Imagine the scholar in his underground chamber, lamp flickering, pen moving across paper, mind engaged with celestial mathematics while his body rests in Earth's cool embrace. Imagine the merchant in his wind tower house, the Shah in his palace, all of them negotiating with summer in their different ways. The distance between their world and ours is measured not just in centuries but in degrees of comfort. We have climbed far from their daily struggle, but they endured, they adapted, they invented, they survived. Their persistence built civilizations in places that seem barely habitable. Their ingenuity created beauty and knowledge despite climate's assault. As you close your eyes and feel sleep approaching, let the story of summer in ancient Persia drift through your thoughts. Let it soften into dream, into that borderland between waking and sleep, where history and imagination merge. You are safe. You are cool. You are far removed from the heat we have explored together. But they are with you too, in a way, all those people who lived before mechanical comfort, who sweated and adapted and endured. They are the ancestors of our species' relationship with climate, the proof that humans can inhabit almost anywhere if they must, if they are clever enough, if they are patient enough. Let your breathing slow now. Let the story settle into memory, into the place where histories rest when their telling is complete. The craftsman is sleeping on his roof. The scholar has set down his pen. The merchant reclines in cool darkness. The wind towers turn in night breezes, the ice sits cold in deep pits, the stars wheel overhead, indifferent and eternal. And you, dear listener, can rest now too. You have travelled far through heat and time. You have felt what it was to live before the hum of air conditioning, before the easy comfort we take as natural. You have walked through summer's fire and emerged into the peace of understanding. Sleep now, gently and well. Let the plateau's dust settle. Let the sun's memory fade into the coolness of your present. Let history become dream, and dream become the quiet darkness of rest. The journey is complete, the story is told, and you, having travelled it with us, can now release it and drift into your own summer dreams. Dreams perhaps of fountains and stars, of wind towers and ice, of the vast patient endurance of people long gone, but not forgotten. Good night, traveller. Sleep deeply, and when morning comes and you wake refreshed in your climate-controlled comfort, remember for just a moment the summer we visited together, the heat we explored, the lives we witnessed. Remember and be grateful for the distance you have travelled from their world to yours. But remember too their resilience, their intelligence, their refusal to be defeated by climate. They are part of you, part of all of us, the human family that learned to survive and even flourish in places that seemed to forbid human habitation. Rest now in your comfort. Dream of ancient summers. And let the knowledge of how people once lived, how they suffered and adapted and endured, lull you gently into the deepest and most peaceful sleep.